What's up guys, Patrick here at Combat Athlete Physio, and today we're treating hip pain in a BJJ athlete. Please tell me that I can't, that I won't, that I fail, that I'll never make it out, yeah. Please tell me all the bad, never good, fill my head full of every single doubt, yeah. Please say any negative thoughts. So Troy came to me with pain in his hip that started after letting a student he was teaching practice a hip lock. The student went a little too hard, shocker, and he started to have pain in the front of his hip. His main painful position was when he was lifting his leg or letting his knee move inward while his foot was planted. The pain had been going on for a few days but had calmed down after he stretched and rested on his own. I started by palpating the structures in the anterior hip and groin, which started some familiar pain and tenderness. These muscular structures at the front of the hip are meant to flex and adduct the hip. I also performed strength testing to the muscles that abduct and externally rotate the hip, which were notably weaker than the opposite side. Now, this makes sense since the muscles on the outside of the hip that externally rotate and abduct the hip are meant to stabilize the hip in the opposite direction of the mechanism of injury. The next test would have been the fader test, which stands for flexion, adduction, and internal rotation, and is intended to stress the inner part of the hip joint. The fader test is essentially a hip lock performed with much less force. Since I already had a good idea of the mechanism of injury, I decided not to put him in an already provocative position. So he was tender to palpation in the hip flexors and adductors, which had likely become tight and protective of the inner hip joint. He had weak lateral hip stabilizers, and he had a mechanism that was just a variation of the fader test. My clinical impression was that he had had an acute hip impingement injury. Hip impingement is when the head of the femur and the acetabulum or hip socket are pressed together with enough force to cause pain. I started him out with some light to moderate pressure foam rolling to help the muscular tone in the front of his hip. Then I performed some manual joint mobilizations and reinforced that with banded mobilizations he could do at home. I initially gave him a clamshell exercise, but that was too easy, so I progressed it to a dynamic clamshell while holding a side plank, which proved much more challenging and more likely to achieve the desired adaptation. He was quickly able to add in some hip flexion exercises to help with anterior hip stability and control. Within a couple of weeks, he was back to destroying me on a regular basis. Just as a disclaimer, these exercises are for his specific situation. If you try these exercises and they work for you, then that's great. But if you try them for a couple of days and nothing seems to be working, then you need to have a clinician evaluate you. So if you're having similar pain, do not hesitate to reach out to me on Instagram or email me at combatathletephysio@gmail.com. Both of those links are in the description. We'll see you guys next time.